In September 1985, a 64-year-old man sat in a television studio in New York City. He looked like an ordinary American. Gray hair, a Colorado tan, a quiet face, the kind of man nobody would look at twice. He had spent decades working in America. He had taught skiing. He had worked construction. He had played tennis. He had married an American woman. He had raised a family. And for 20 years, his wife had known him as Dennis F. Wiles. But that morning, sitting beneath the bright lights of a national television studio, he was about to say something that would change the story of his entire life. His name was not Dennis Wiles. His name was Georg Gärtner. He had once been a German soldier. He had been captured in North Africa. He had been brought to America as a prisoner of war. And 40 years earlier, he had escaped. Then he disappeared. Not for weeks, not for months, for 4 decades. To understand why he ran, you have to go back to the beginning. December 18, 1920. Schweidnitz, Lower Silesia. Georg Gärtner was born into an ordinary German family. He had a brother, a sister. He grew up in a Germany that was still recovering from the First World War. By the time he was 19, Europe was once again going to war. In 1940, Gärtner entered the German army. He was 19 years old, still barely more than a boy. He was sent to North Africa. The desert became his battlefield. He served with the German forces fighting alongside Rommel's Afrika Korps. For years, the war moved across the desert. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, convoys, heat, dust. And then, in 1943, everything collapsed. The Axis position in Tunisia was breaking apart. Hundreds of thousands of German and Italian soldiers were captured. Gärtner was among them. He had entered the war as a German soldier. Now he was a prisoner. The British captured him. Then he was transferred to American custody. And eventually, he was placed aboard a ship crossing the Atlantic. For the first time in his life, Georg Gärtner was going to America. But he wasn't going there as a tourist. He was going there behind barbed wire. American POW camps were scattered across the country. German prisoners were transported deep into the American interior. Gärtner eventually ended up at a camp near Deming, New Mexico. The landscape must have seemed almost unreal. Flat desert, hard ground, distant mountains, endless sky. There were no European battlefields here. No German towns, no North African dunes. Just America. Inside the camp, prisoners lived under guard. They ate in mess halls, worked on labor details, earned small amounts of canteen credit, and waited for the war to end. Then, in May 1945, Germany surrendered. The war was over. For most prisoners, that meant one thing: going home. But for Georg Gärtner, those words meant something very different, because the place he called home was about to disappear. Schweidnitz was in Silesia. After the war, the borders of Europe were redrawn. The territory was transferred to Poland. The German population of the region was being expelled. Millions of Germans were forced from territories that had been their homes for generations. Gärtner understood that he might not be returning to the Germany he had left. He didn't know what waited for him. He didn't know what had happened to his family, and he feared being sent east. The American government was preparing to repatriate prisoners, but Gärtner saw the journey differently. The train wasn't taking him home. It was taking him somewhere he no longer recognized. So he made a decision. He would not go. September 1945. The war had been over for months. At the POW camp in Deming, the prisoners were still waiting for transportation. Then one night, Gärtner made his move. There was no tunnel, no forged passport, no dramatic firefight, no stolen military vehicle. He simply waited. Then he crawled underneath the gates. He got outside and walked toward the railroad. Somewhere in the darkness, a freight train was coming. Gärtner had studied its schedule. He knew when it would pass. The train arrived, and he climbed aboard. That was his escape, a German prisoner disappearing into the American night. No army waiting for him, no plan for the next morning, no destination, just one decision: don't go back. Most escaped prisoners were caught quickly. Gärtner was different. He wasn't trying to reach another country. He wasn't trying to return to Germany. He was trying to disappear. He traveled west. Eventually, he reached California, and there he began creating another life. At first, survival meant ordinary work: dishwasher, laborer, farm worker, lumberjack, anything that paid. He had to learn how to become someone else. Eventually, he adopted the name Dennis F. Wiles. The German soldier disappeared. The American man appeared. And every day, the distance between the two became larger. He learned English. He changed his story. He avoided questions about his childhood. He avoided questions about Europe. He avoided anything that might lead someone toward the truth. For most people, a new name is just a name. For Gärtner, it was a wall. Behind that wall was Georg. In front of it was Dennis. and nobody was allowed to see both. Then something happened that made the deception much harder. He met a woman. Her name was Jean Clark. They met at a YMCA dance. They fell in love. And in 1964, they married. Gärtner became part of an American family. He helped raise Jean's 2 children. He worked. He taught skiing. He became a tennis professional. He lived among Americans. He became, in almost every visible way, an American. But there was still one thing he could never completely become: free from his past. He couldn't simply explain where he had been before America. He couldn't tell his wife the truth. He couldn't travel freely outside the United States. He couldn't produce a normal history. Every question about his childhood was dangerous. Every question about Germany had an answer he had rehearsed. And the longer the marriage lasted, the heavier the secret became. 20 years passed. Then Jean began pressing him about his past. And finally, he told her. The man she had married wasn't Dennis Wiles. He was Georg Gärtner, a German prisoner of war, a man who had escaped from an American camp 40 years earlier. Jean could have walked away. Instead, she urged him to come forward. And Gärtner finally decided to surrender. But he didn't walk into a police station. He did something much stranger. He went on television. September 1985. The Today Show. New York City. Millions of Americans were watching. Bryant Gumbel was sitting across from him. And there was Georg Gärtner, 64 years old. After 40 years of hiding, he finally said his real name. Georg Gärtner. For 4 decades, the United States government had considered him an escaped prisoner. Now he was sitting on national television, surrendering himself. But there was a strange problem. What exactly was America supposed to do with him? The war had been over for 40 years. Nazi Germany was gone. The political borders he had feared were completely different. And the young German soldier who had escaped in 1945 was now an elderly American man. The government ultimately decided not to deport him. His life continued. He remained in America. He stayed connected to the woman who had known him as Dennis. And eventually, decades later, he became an American citizen. He died in Colorado on January 30th, 2013. He was 92 years old. But the strangest part of Georg Gärtner's story isn't that he escaped. It isn't even that he remained free for 40 years. It's what he was running from. He wasn't running toward another army. He wasn't planning another war. He wasn't trying to sabotage America. He was afraid that the place he called home no longer existed. A 19-year-old German had entered the army in 1940. A 22-year-old soldier had been captured in Tunisia. A 24-year-old prisoner had escaped from an American camp. And then, he spent the next 40 years becoming someone else. He became a worker, a husband, a stepfather, a ski instructor, a tennis professional, an American, all while carrying one secret inside him. The world knew him as Dennis Wiles. But somewhere beneath that name, Georg Gärtner was still there, waiting. And on one morning in 1985, after 40 years, he finally came back. Not to Germany, not to the army, not to the battlefield, but to the truth. Because sometimes the longest escape isn't across a border. It's the distance between the person you were and the person you spend your entire life pretending to be. And Georg Gärtner crossed that distance for 40 years, until one morning, he finally stopped running.